The reason that people invest in corporations is to get a return. And so I buy stocks, I buy bonds, and I am looking to either have dividends or interest or to sell them later at a capital gain. So I'm trying to make a profit. Now, the corporation, when it makes a profit, and remember, profit is the excess of revenue over costs. So I have a bunch of contracts with my input suppliers. All of them are voluntary. I'm making all of my input suppliers better off. I make something then in my factory and I go and sell it voluntarily to people in the output market. So I sell it to consumers. All of them value it more than it costs or they wouldn't buy it. So if I have some money left over afterwards, that's called profit.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jesse Fragale, and you're listening to Working Capital, the real estate podcast. My special guest today is Michael Munger. He's an American economist and former chair of political science at the Department of Economics at Duke University. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm well. I hope you are.
Very well. As some of the listeners might know, I'm a huge fan of Econ Talk. If it's the first time you're hearing this, it's a great podcast. I would check them out. I was just talking to Mike here. I think he's been as a guest, probably the reigning champ in terms of how many times you've been on that. But that's definitely how...
Almost 50 times.
Yeah, which is wild. So that's initially how I came across, basically your ideas. And what I'd like to do is to take a step back here is for the listeners who don't know, maybe you could give a little bit of the background as to how you got into the economic space and what you were doing at Duke and what you're currently doing.
I was an undergraduate at Davidson College, which is a small liberal arts college in North Carolina, and one of my teachers there was really great at explaining economics. And I have tried to. I'm not smart enough to do theory. I'm not a good enough mathematician to generate new results. So I think one of the reasons that Russ Roberts has had me on so often is that by the time I figure something out, I can explain it. Now, there's a lot of things I haven't figured out, but by the time I figure something out, I can explain it. And in economics, there's a big space for that because there's a lot of people that don't know much about economics that are talking about it. And there's a lot of people who know a lot about economics that can't explain it. And so what I have tried to do is to live in the space where my writing and my teaching is trying to make sure that people can understand some of the things that seem really complicated. And there's just so many, I don't think mistakes is too strong in the way that public policy addresses the difficulties that we have with a lot of things that we need. And housing and land are some of the most important ones because everybody has an opinion about it. We all have, there's not enough affordable housing. Well, I'm not sure there could be enough affordable housing because what we would all like is to live in mansions for free. And so on a big lot in the middle of a city so that we can walk to work. We can't do that. And so the question is, what system is going to give us the best that we can accomplish in an imperfect world where people all want different things? And there's not actually very many systems. My friend Pete Boettke at George Mason University often talks about the fact that we have to be comparativists. So people will look at markets, but people will look at real estate markets. People will look at how expensive rents are, say, in Toronto or San Francisco, and they'll say, well, the markets are terrible. We need to do something else. Well, the alternative isn't very good either. So if we have government planning and government allocation of apartments, then we'll have little cookie cutter apartments. All of them will be 120 square meters. And they'll all be the same price. We can afford them, but there's not very much new production. There's not much innovation. And so the difficulty that we have is that we have two not very good systems. We have the market system and we have some sort of socialism or centrally planned system, and we have to work within those constraints. And I think people on both sides make the mistake of looking at one of the systems, say, this is terrible. We should use the other. In fact, we should make the comparison, recognizing that there's a lot of difficulties between both of those two things. And I have a twice monthly column at American Institute for Economic Research. If people were interested in, I write quite a bit about housing. And my basic thesis on housing is that all housing is affordable housing. So the thing that I try to argue over and over again is that all housing is affordable housing. Because if we build more housing, it's going to increase the housing stock and it's going to reduce the pressure, the upward pressure on prices. So often people, well, we need to build more affordable housing. What we need to do is make it legal to build housing. If we just do that, it'll make a big difference. But in many large cities in North America, it's almost literally illegal to build new housing.
So, in terms of the actual stipulations and regulations in certain areas, what's nice about the states is that you can see these little projects in different states. One state having one type of housing policy, and another state having a different housing policy. The Canadian equivalent of that is a little bit more monolithic. Some provinces vary, but we're pretty standardized. Where do you find what states do you find are getting housing right or development right, and which ones are not? And what do you think the main drivers of that are?
The hard problem that the states have is trying to understand all of the many differences among states. We have different tax policies. We have different housing policies, to be sure, but we have different tax policies. We have different rates of growth of the economy. So there are some states that are doing very well in terms of housing prices, like West Virginia, because they're losing 2 or 3% population per year. And so they have a lot of empty space. That's not something you want. And so I'm working on a white paper for AIER now, trying to look at the simultaneous movements of three things. So housing prices year by year for the last 30 years, changes in population year by year for the last 30 years, and then an index of housing openness or freedom, in the sense that it is possible to build or amend existing housing to use it for different reasons. And it turned the strongest effect that I have found across states. So I'm literally comparing this across states. Strongest effect that I have found is that more housing openness, more flexibility to build, amend use, to change zoning, is the biggest break on increase in housing prices, trying to control for changes in population. So if you look at Texas, North Carolina, basically the places that have grown a lot, they tend to be in the Sun Belt, and they're encouraging to not just new people moving in, but to the horrible, and I'm making air quotes, developers that are going to make money by building housing. And the thing that always surprises me is the antipathy towards people that are trying to provide something that other people desperately need. But the fact that they're going to make profits from it mean that somehow we should exact from them all sorts of concessions. And so the states that have not done that are both increasing in population and not seeing big increases in housing prices.
So you've talked on Russ's program before about kind of the free market, your view on free markets, and I find that the villain oftentimes is the capitalist. But when it relates to housing, I can't think of somebody more villainous than the developer or the landlord. What do you think? What's wrong with our?
They should have a long mustache. They're twirling it. They're tying the renters to the railroad track.
Yeah, and what do you think that is? Is there something philosophical underpinning that this is people's? It's so intimate, the relationship between what service landlords provide. Where your family lives, where your loved ones rest their head. Is there something going on there that creates this type of this view of landlords or developers because they are providing such a fragile commodity?
The answer is complicated. There's a couple of ways to go with it. First, let me say that for some reason, we highlight the greed of developers more than the greed of homeowners. So suppose I want to build a high density, multi-person unit in an existing neighborhood, and the existing neighborhood right now is zoned to have 1 acre lots and single family detached homes. Now, if I do that, it might change the housing prices for the people that already live in that neighborhood. And if this is in California, they have had 1,000% increase in the value of that house. So they are not willing to reduce the price of their house to make it more affordable, but no one calls them greedy. So the developer that is trying to build houses that poor people could afford, somehow that's the greedy person. And the people that are not willing to allow affordable housing in their neighborhood, they perceive themselves as defenders of the neighborhood. And so what I worry, and this is me talking, this is not Jesse, this is me talking. So if somebody wants to get mad, I worry that this sort of neighborhood protection idea is just a way for white liberals to be racist. It is a way to prevent having poor people move into our neighborhood. And we tell some story about neighborhood integrity. That's all the people in Alabama wanted when they wanted segregated schools, too. They wanted to preserve the character of their neighborhood. Well, cities change, and cities that are successful are dynamic and allow for those dynamic changes. The second thing to your question, the big paradox, and people who don't understand economics don't recognize this. Why is it that so many landlords are unresponsive, unwilling to make repairs, and are just jerks? And in fact, will often engage in what seems like racism. Well, if you have price controls, if you have a control that prevents rent from being charged at market rates, that means there's 100 people that want this apartment. And I can be mean to you and you will not move out because there is no way for you to find another apartment at this same price. So as a result, you're creating these restrictions on rents are creating the circumstances that actually encourage racism, abuse, and a refusal to do repairs. Because I'm happy if you move out, because then I can charge market rates. And so price controls are a big reason why a lot of landlords come across as greedy. Whereas if you were charging market rates, they would be responsive. We're preventing capitalism from working. So of course, under a essentially socialist system where we're not allowing competition, only greed can operate. I am going then to treat you really badly. We're not allowing the good part of this system to work. And people stay in these rent controlled. There's a variety of kinds of rent control. So I'm just going to call it by the simple name rent control. There's a variety of kinds of rent control. Wealthy people will stay in these rent controlled apartments for a very long time. They would like to move somewhere nicer, but there's no way they can get something for the equivalent of a 2-bedroom apartment in a nice part of town for $1,200 a month. I'm going to stay here. And so as a result, all of what should be affordable housing is not being made available because people are stuck because of these artificial advantages that are created basically by privilege. So it's a set of privileges that the government is creating, and wealthy people hold on to them.
Do you think there's something based on this? I notice with a lot of the kind of free market concepts, I'm sure you've read it before, a short essay by Frederick Bastiat. I think it's The Seen and the Unseen. I always think about it when it comes to policies, because the unseen situation is that you're talking about is that if you just got rid of rent control or rent destabilization, depending on what market you're in, we would see the prices slowly come down as competition eats up some of that pricing. But that's unseen. And is there something to that people are not able to actually see the fruits of that type of policy change?
Well, yes. So what I see is these apartments are not well kept up and they're really expensive. What I don't see is what the set of apartments in this neighborhood would look like if we allowed the sort of scolding winds of competition to discipline these landlords. And so we would have new buildings and cheaper rents instead of being stuck with these old buildings. I mean, something we haven't talked about yet is one of the difficulties in many cities in the United States. If I actually wanted to build a new multi-unit facility, it's going to take me 7 or 8 years before I can break ground. So I have to buy the options on the land. I have my money tied up in that. I have a bunch of permissions. I have to ask the neighbors if it is okay because they, for some reason, think God gave them the right to park for free. They should not have to pay to park, but other people should have to pay to park because we're here first. We're going to pull up the ladder to the treehouse. And so poor people take the bus. They don't need cars. But what we do is we impose a restriction that says each unit has to have 1.7, 1.8 parking spaces. And since it can't be on the street, it has to be underground. A dramatic increase in the cost of the building. And then we say, but now they won't build affordable units. What bastards? Nobody can afford that. It was because of the restriction. So the idea that for some reason people that got there first should forever have free parking. And there's a bunch of other restrictions like that, but that's a good example. Setbacks, minimum unit size, the restrictions that we have on building new apartments. I did an estimate for Raleigh, North Carolina. If you were an altruist, Raleigh, North Carolina is the capital of the state of North Carolina. It's not a gigantic city. The area is about 1.2 million. If you were to build a new apartment building and 2 bedrooms right downtown and obey all of the restrictions, there is no way you could have that 2-bedroom apartment for less than $2,800 a month. And that's without any profit. That's just paying the cost. Now, that's not affordable. But that means that we have imposed a set of restrictions that actually make it literally illegal to build affordable housing. Unsurprisingly, we're not building any affordable housing.
So one of the other kind of pushbacks that we get with, if you call it, quote, air quotes, free market capitalism as it pertains to real estate, especially during the U.S. election, I've heard a number of people campaigning more left leaning, basically talking about we don't want houses in the States being bought up by BlackRock. We don't want single family houses being commodified that way. For somebody that takes a more free market approach, what are they missing if they're missing anything there? What's the argument for the ability to have commodification and let larger companies choose to purchase even single family housing?
You already explained it. It's the seen and the unseen. So we have restrictions that make it impossible to have anything except single family housing in this neighborhood. And by far, under those circumstances, by far the most valuable use of these houses is for Airbnb and short-term rentals. And so, unsurprisingly, given the profit opportunity, if I've got idle capital, I'm going to buy up 10 of these things because I can make way more money on this than anything else because the government has obligingly made it impossible for anybody to compete with me. So one thing we could do is say, well, we're going to restrict doing that. Another thing we could do is make competition legal, make it possible to build more houses, make it possible to build multifamily units, because then the benefit that right now private capital is going to get from buying these up and then using them basically as hotels, but use Airbnb to run the all of the administrative services. Second best, I can understand that. I am sympathetic to the idea that we should block private capital from buying up these homes, and we probably should outlaw Airbnb because it's too restrictive. But the solution is not to stop there. The solution is to make it possible to build affordable housing, because then there won't be these profit opportunities. So like you said, it was the unseen. The what we don't see is how the government regulations, well-intentioned. I'm not saying that there's some nefarious purpose, but these well-intentioned government regulations result in artificial profits. And it's unsurprisingly that private capital is going to do that. You can't blame a dog for eating out of the garbage. It's what dogs do.
So in that case, so for us, working in the commercial real estate space, it's maybe surprising to some people. It's not to us that when we deal with pension funds, we deal with larger REITs. The deals are more seamless, and there's actually more accountability for these companies. Surprise, surprise. What do you think it is about again, back to kind of the question with something like housing where you have a huge conglomerate purchasing this type of housing? Is it the fact that it's just the, that old vision of a greedy capitalist coming in and purchasing something that should be done on a mom and pop level or at the family level?
Again, the answer to the question was pretty persuasive. Actually, it is easier to find and correct abuse when it's on a large scale because you can identify the company that is doing it. So, and the results of a lawsuit that they would suffer from are much more likely to discipline them. So I don't think that the problem is it should only be done by mom and pop mustache twiddling bad guys. Having a few large mustache twiddling bad guys is probably the best we can hope for. The difficulty is that we don't recognize the extent to which why the profits are resulting from government regulations that don't really seem that connected to the buying up by private capital. They're also sitting on huge piles of cash. So I think this is a relatively short-term problem. Interest rates in the United States especially were artificially low for quite a while, and it meant that a lot of companies were sitting on giant piles of cash. They were looking for some kind of positive rates of return. And so as it's sort of self-reinforcing, one of the reasons that I want to buy housing is that housing is going up. But if all these companies put their cash in housing, then houses go up. It still ends up looking a lot like a bubble. And what happened in 2007 through 2009 in the United States was a caution about housing, but in many places it has kind of happened again. Although during COVID, a lot of prices came down, and rental costs in particular in large cities have come down, at least in the U.S., because a lot of people didn't want to live there. They've moved out because they can work remotely. So there's a bunch of things that are going on all at once. But Northern California still has the problem that it's illegal to build new housing. And it's interesting, the Obama administration and the left in the United States have actually come to realize that we need to restrict the ability of cities to prevent new affordable housing.
So I want to switch over to, I think it was a relatively recent podcast that you did on Bruno Leone, and it was pretty fascinating about legislation and the law. But before we go to that, while I have you here, I want to get your thoughts on corporate income tax. To me, this was something, I think in my undergrad, that I don't know if it was Milton Friedman or somebody I was reading, where it seemed to me like a no-brainer after reading that the corporate income tax should be zero. And it's a crazy thing to say at a cocktail party because it just sounds like you're an absolute, you're just against the people. Can you work out, or, for somebody doesn't see the kind of economic mechanics in the background of what the argument is for a corporate income tax of zero?
The reason that people invest in corporations is to get a return. And so I buy stocks, I buy bonds, and I am looking to either have dividends or interest, or to sell them later at a capital gain. So I'm trying to make a profit. Now, the corporation, when it makes a profit, and remember, profit is the excess of revenue over costs. So I have a bunch of contracts with my input suppliers. All of them are voluntary. I'm making all of my input suppliers better off. I make something then in my factory, and I go and sell it voluntarily to people in the output market. So I sell it to consumers. All of them value it more than it costs, or they wouldn't buy it. So if I have some money left over afterwards, that's called profit. Now, corporate income tax is a tax on profits. And so what we're encouraging companies to do, if we have a corporate income tax, is to do something that will reduce their taxes. And so anytime you tax something, you reduce the incentive to do it. In corporate income tax, it is particularly excruciating because that is subject to what Milton Friedman correctly called double taxation. So we tax the corporate profits, And then, so some of that money is taken away. And now the stock price goes up or down. If it goes up and then I sell it, I have to pay taxes on that as a taxpayer. But I've already lost some of the taxes because they were paid on the corporate income tax to begin with. And so the problem of double taxation is that it's going to be taxed at the time that I sell the stock or that I get the dividend. So the profit from the companies is being passed through. If there's a corporate income tax, it's not going to be passed through. The company is going to undertake sometimes radically distorted ways of reducing their taxes, but that also means that there's going to be less profits in the system because we're not going to be able to hire new people. The way that we hire new people, profit is a signal that we need more of this stuff. The stuff that I'm making, society likes. Well, if we have taxes on profits, there's the distortion of saying we're going to try to hide it. So two main arguments. That was a bunch of stuff. Two main arguments. One is the problem of double taxation, which is inefficient. The other is the distorting effect where we get less growth and less increase in employment because we're taxing something that we actually want to use as the seed corn to invest tomorrow. So the big difficulty that the US and Canada have, which is kind of strange compared, because many of my colleagues at Duke are on the left, they're big fans of Northern Europe. Northern Europe, for the most part, uses a value added tax, which is a sales tax, not an income tax. Sweden doesn't have an income tax. Hmm. And so if you want less of something, you should tax it. Now, is it bad when people work and get income? No, that's good. Is it bad when people spend excessively on consumption? Well, maybe. And so taxing that gives people more of an incentive to share. So we're back to my claim before. There's nothing wrong in principle with a corporate income tax. It's just that there's a better solution. And the two better solutions are private income tax with a zero corporate income tax, and then a value-added tax operates quite efficiently in Northern Europe. The argument that I think people want for corporate income tax is the old doggerel from England: don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that man behind the tree. Corporations, for the most part, don't vote. They're relatively small. In fact, unions don't care. It's fine with them. So even the workers for the corporation are probably okay with it being taxed. And so they're relatively politically weak, and it is a source of revenue, but the distortions are not worth the revenue. And so we're better off taxing people directly. And I would say there's an additional benefit, and that is that I should know how much the government is spending. If the government is taking a lot of its revenue from corporations, that's kind of hidden to me. I don't notice the reduction in growth. I don't notice the reduction in increases in jobs. I just say, well, the economy's sluggish.
So with the argument, somebody will push back and say, if you we're currently taxing corporations, let's call it, 10%. We take that away. It's this idea that this money is just going to be hoarded by these companies. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, it inverts reality. It's being hoarded now by these companies because they don't want to take them as profits because they'll have to pay tax on them. If there's no tax, it is more likely that they would invest, that they would pass them back through to consumers. So the problem that we have is that the corporate income tax is the reason why companies sit on gigantic amounts of cash rather than passing them through as profits. I think the difficulty that many people have is that they see corporations as the CEO. There's this person. They have a lot of money. Well, they're paying income taxes. That's not actually right. So the corporation is a legal person only in the sense that this limits the liability for which it can be sued. Under most circumstances, corporate personhood is not a justification for treating them as a person under the tax system. That's a different thing. And so I wrote a piece for AIER not long ago about ultras, and so about unrealized gains. And the Roosevelt administration was just furious that the corporations had these undeclared profits because they might buy an asset, and then as they hold the asset, it increases in value. Well, that means that they're wealthier. We should tax that unrealized gain in the underlying asset. We should take part of that. So they want to go farther than just saying that, because I wouldn't have to hoard it in cash. I can hoard it in real estate. I can hoard it in building a bunch of new factories, and all of that, there's a value there. If you think you should be taxing that, that's crazy. That's the seed corn. That's where value comes from.
Well, it's interesting on the unrealized capital gains. This always pops up when elections are happening, but you never really hear the other side of the equation. So if I have losses year after year, are you going to give me tax deductions for those unrealized
Credits.
losses?
Yeah, credits.
Yeah, credits, exactly. So in your perfect world, would you be more in favor of, from an income tax perspective, a flat tax up to a certain rate? Because I know that both the US and Canada, we both have progressive policies. And I think one of the challenge with some people about just a value add tax, or, and like we have here, a goods and services tax, that it's more, it penalizes lower income people on a percentage basis more. So what would what would be Mike's king for a day?
There's a lot to that. The simple answer is that it looks like we have a progressive tax system, but in fact we don't, because the tax system is larded up with a bunch of deductions. That means that nobody pays the published rate. And that's the thing about corporate taxes also. So let me just admit, I'm Catholic. One of the things the Catholic Church has been guilty of in the past was selling dispensations. So we'll start out saying, if you sin, you're all going to hell, unless you give the church some money. Well, you're all going to have to pay really high tax rates unless you give your congressman some money and they will give you a dispensation from this. So the deductions are incredible. Nobody pays the published tax rate. So in order to have a flat tax, we would need to do two things: have a relatively low flat tax with two different rates. So, 10% and then 20%. No deductions, none. That would mean that people would actually know that they were going to have to pay. And the result would be that you wouldn't see these distortions that result in people doing these elaborate accounting tricks to try to avoid taxes. So if we had a flat tax and a sales tax, it could be revenue neutral, but just having a flat tax and getting rid of the deductions might be revenue neutral. It is easy to make a sales tax progressive. And that means that people have to keep their receipts, particularly for large purposes, and just make the first $20,000, $30,000 that you spend exempt. And so I pay sales taxes, and then at the end of now many people at the end of the year, they get they get their taxes back because they overpaid. You could do the same thing with sales taxes, and just there's a standard deduction. The first in the US, $12,000 of my income is exempt from taxation. The first $20,000 of my spending is exempt from taxation. And whatever that level is, you can make it more or less progressive. And since many people in the United States, 50% of people in the US don't pay income tax, we could make it so 50% don't pay this federal value added tax by having a $20,000 or $25,000 deduction. So the problem of progressivity is easily solved.
I've never actually, that's interesting. I've never thought of it from that standpoint, where you would just have general deductions at the end of the year. You purchase a car, you purchase, whatever.
You have monthly rent. You have a bunch of big things, and you're not going to pay taxes on that. That makes it much, much less regressive.
Mm-hmm. So I want to be mindful of the time here, Mike, but for listeners, I would love to just briefly chat, and maybe this will necessitate a further conversation, but I want to chat a bit about law and legislation. I think just kind of the quote being that in a lot of cases, we do not need legislation. So I guess, from the outset, you've talked about this a number of times. Could you basically talk a little bit about the distinction between the two in the way that, you're discussing it here?
There are three domains where we have to make decisions together, and we need knowledge of what is the right thing to do. So one of those we might call politics. And generally in politics, we use voting to figure things out. Now in the US, we just figured something out. Who do you want to be president? Well, it turns out we wanted Donald Trump. Now there's a bunch of people that didn't, but there was a majority in this case that did. So the way that we figure things out in politics is what a majority wants. Often the majority may not be that well informed. When it comes to economic policy, it may be hard to make those decisions using pure majority. Another possibility is that we could have a legislature, and the legislature is going to pass statutes, and there's a process by which statutes are arrived at. So we elect politicians, they pass statutes, and then those things are the rules. But it's really hard for anyone to know enough to be able to decide all of the ways that disputes over contracts should be adjudicated. These situations are very complicated. So there's a third one that actually we have been using, by we I mean humans, since the early part of the Roman Republic, and that is what Friedrich Hayek and Bruno Leone called law. Now, law sounds a lot like a statute, but it's not. A law is the way that we do things, the conventional way that we do things. And from Roman law, the British system, and I think to some extent Canada uses this also, the way that it came forward to us is called the common law. And so the common law is grown or emergent or judge-made law, where over time judges use many different arguments or rationales for adjudicating a dispute that is basically the same set of facts. So I have failed to pay my rent for 3 months. You want to evict me. What's the procedure? Now, the municipality may have an ordinance that says that, but the common law can say you can file a suit against me from a tort. How does the judge decide? You owe me money. How are we going to decide how to do that? Well, there are precedents. The precedents are those decisions that have come down to us from the past that are basically congealed wisdom. So the institution of precedent is this seems to be a good way to resolve a dispute that has a set of facts that look like this. And so one of the things that I think people undervalue is this common law approach that is, as Bruno Leone talked about, and if people are interested, they should listen to that podcast. Bruno Leone thought that almost all disputes could be resolved by using a kind of common law approach where judges, and these judges wouldn't even have to be employed by the government. For him, he thought, you and I write a contract. One of the contract provisions is, how much do I owe you? One of the contract provisions is, what do you have to give to me that I've paid you for? And another one would be, in the event of a dispute, what entity will have binding arbitration or adjudication over this? And we could have professional private judges that decide this, that compete based on reputation. And so Leone thought that would be a better way to resolve these than if someone in Toronto has had this kind of dispute, it probably takes you 18 months to get a court date. It is very difficult. If you're trying to evict someone or someone's been injured, it's going to take forever to use the formal legal process using statutes. And so having a parallel private process that uses the common law, and by law, I mean the emergent judge-made law, not statutes that are made either by democracy or by elected representatives in the Congress. And so that's not to say, Leone actually thought that almost everything could be done by that. I think that's probably excessive. But we should do a lot more than we do of allowing people to use these private dispute resolution mechanisms and arbitration, because for one thing, the overloaded courts would not be so burdened. It would also be much faster. But here's the real thing. Here's the thing that excites me about this, is that if we actually knew what the law is, that this is the conventions, these are how we do things, there wouldn't be any disputes because we know what the outcome is going to be. So if you could skip the whole court process because you know in advance what the outcome would have been, we can settle. We know what it's going to be. I will just settle. I will pay you. All right, here's what I would have owed. And so the exciting thing about this is the potential to not have to use the legal system at all, because we know what the law is. And that was Leone's main concern, was the clarity and certainty of the law. And most people, I think, don't know housing law. If you have to go and look at the set of statutes, if you're a landlord, you need an attorney to, can I do this? I don't know. I'll have to look. That's a sad state of affairs.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the common law to me is it's like a free, more of a free market version of civil or statute.
Leone made exactly that analogy, that the evolution of the common law and the evolution of the market system are exactly parallel.
Mm-hmm. And it's for people that don't see it on a daily basis, like not necessarily for residential real estate, but in my space and commercial real estate, arbitration clauses are, the bread and butter of most of our lease agreements, most of our contracts, and they're actually used. And oftentimes they're used not necessarily to the point where you're at arbitration, but just at the threat of arbitration.
Yeah.
And everybody who's been in my industry does not want to go down the actual legal route.
Yeah.
And arbitration is oftentimes threatened. But like you said, when these transactions have happened thousands of times, people kind of get what the outcome's going to be, and they try to negotiate in good faith with the other party. Most times, 99 times out of 100.
It's the threat of the dispute resolution mechanism that gets us to settle. And the threat of using, well, I'm going to tie you up in court for 2 years, that gives both of us too much power. Each of us can act badly and then insist on being compensated. This is going to be resolved in 2 months, and we know how it's going to be resolved, means we'll settle.
Mm-hmm. Mike, we're at the time here. I want to give individuals who want to, are interested in what you're writing, interested in connecting with you online. I know probably a Google search of your name, Mike Munger, will do it. Is there anything specific you'd like to say?
Yes, I have a podcast myself. It's called The Answer is Transaction Costs. So I talk about quite a few of the issues that arise from the fact that disputes are noisy, contracts are hard to enforce. It's quite wide ranging. The one this month is going to be about prison gangs, because prison gangs are a way of enforcing agreements in a setting where obviously you can't use the police. So within a prison, there's much less violence because prison gangs control access to violence. So that's The Answer is Transaction Cost is the name of my podcast. And on Twitter, I am at Mungowitz, Mungowitz. So at Mungowitz.
My guest today has been Mike Munger. Mike, thanks for being part of Working Capital.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.